I'm Lori Fleckett of Soltar Solutions, and I'm here today on Focus Forward with a very good friend of mine, Regina Barr, and we're going to be talking about the topic of assessments. No one I can think of is more qualified to talk about this topic than Regina. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Regina.
Thanks, Lori. I'm really excited to talk about assessments with you today.
Me too. I really want to get down and learn more about them. So first of all, what are assessments?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people call them tests, which I am very careful to avoid that they are not tests. Assessments are just tools, and they're tools that are designed to help us learn more about ourselves. And if we're learning more about ourselves, very often we're learning more about others. And they're tools that can help us be better performers, better communicators, have better relationships with people. So I think if we look at what they can do for us and not exactly what they are, they can be a little less intimidating for people than if we just say assessments.
Yeah, I like that. I don't like the idea of tests, but I do like the idea of assessments because it's sounding like you're really delving in and understanding more about yourself.
Exactly.
So when we talk about assessments, there are so many different types of assessments. Is there a way we can group those assessments, maybe separate them?
You know, the way that I look at them, because again, they're tools, so you can use them individually, if you're working on yourself or working with an individual in your organization, or you can work at the organizational level, so either individual or organizational. And sometimes you might be using similar types of assessment tools, but how you're slicing and dicing them and using them. So for example, you might, do a behavioral type of assessment that you could focus on an individual, but then if you do it with a team, you might be pulling some team reports and assessing at a team level and looking at things more broadly. Or you might use an assessment to, for example, focus on employee engagement. So again, there you're looking at the broad enterprise and you're pulling out certain things. So I like to look at them in the groups of what you might do individually and what you might do organizationally. So hopefully that'll be helpful for folks.
So I love the concept because it seems like it really makes it tangible. Mm-hmm. When you're having your review with your boss or one of the leaders, CEO of the company, whatever, sometimes that doesn't always seem as tangible or maybe as what's the word I'm looking for? Something that you really can rely on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's personalities, sometimes it just doesn't seem like it's based on anything. So that's why I like the idea of assessments. But I've heard people that are afraid of taking assessments. So what about that?
So, it's really interesting to me, a couple things. I think people are fearful because I think they're afraid of being pigeonholed. And I always tell people at the end of the day, you are the final arbiter of what is in that assessment. And a good coach or someone that's certified in the assessments is always going to tell you that, and they will walk through that. So sometimes what will happen is somebody will say, well, I don't think that describes me accurately at all. Okay, let's sit down and let's talk it through. So then I will go through a series of questions. Very often, almost 99% of the time, by the time we're done talking, they agree that the assessment has accurately described them. However, I also want to point out there are things that can skew an assessment. So for example, stress of any kind. Are you sick? Do you have a sick spouse? Are you getting married? Good stress. Are you buying a house? Good stress. Negative stress. Are you getting divorced? So any kind of stress really can skew it, and typically the assessments I use, there's a couple of things I look at, some graphs, and if I see a spike in a certain place, I will immediately ask what's going on, and I'll say a few questions or ask a few questions, and people will be like, are you a mind reader? No, I'm looking at the data that they've provided. So in certain circumstances, if I find that something like that's going on, I recommend that they reassess in 6 months or a year and then see where things land. Because if they're going through something, it doesn't make sense to reassess right away. We work with the data, and then we move forward.
Which was my next question. How often should we actually have assessments?
Well, I think it depends on what we're looking at. So I would say every couple of years for a behavioral type of assessment or something that's focusing on your acumen or your motivators driving forces, those kinds of things. Emotional intelligence, if you are working to develop your emotional intelligence, little different there. That measures a point in time, okay? Whereas typically the other assessments that we look at, the other sciences, are not going to change dramatically over time, but things can influence them. Your emotional intelligence is something you can develop and will change over time. So I say for that, you could look at doing that once a year if you wanted to.
So if you're working towards, say, emotional intelligence, and you say you're capturing a point in time, then you kind of create, as a coach, you would create kind of a plan
Yes.
that they can go through to increase their emotional intelligence.
Yes. So what I would tell you there is, let's put it this way, we all can always be working on ourselves. Even those of us that know a lot about it and have done a lot of work with it, we're working on it too. And if somebody tells you they aren't, you need to find somebody else to work with. So what I usually do, because there can be a range of things, and I don't like people to get overwhelmed, pick one or two things, and that's what I will do with someone. Let's pick one or two things, and let's create a game plan. What are the things you can be doing to move, as I would say, the dial on that particular component? And I also look for the things, what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, right? It's the old 80-20 rule. Don't focus on the little minuscule things. That's not going to help you propel your career forward or, jumpstart you to the next level of your business. Let's focus on the thing that you can get legs around, where you do one thing, but it can help you in a couple of areas. So I think that's really important because, the assessment, again, is a tool. If you don't do anything with it, why bother?
Well, that's always like that.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any negative aspects of taking assessments?
It's interesting. I have not found that to be the case. Sometimes it's interesting, I'll do a 360 with someone, and a 360 is where you get multiple levels of feedback. You provide feedback on yourself. You would have maybe your boss, peers, subordinates, maybe even some people outside the organization. And so the interesting thing is, a lot of times that's the one assessment where I get that, where people have concerns, they feel there might be something negative because they're afraid that people are going to throw them under the bus. But what I have found is most people are very fair, and you know who the most challenging person in that type of assessment is? It's the individual. They are so hard on themselves. They are harder on themselves than anyone else in that kind of assessment, which tends to be, more subjective, if you will, because you're having multiple parties, as opposed to an individual assessment where you're just looking at your core skills and in other areas. So I don't really see the negative. I mean, I've never worked with anyone that has abused assessments, and I'm always very careful to tell people the caveats about how we use assessments. We don't use them to pigeonhole people. We do not use them to excuse poor performance, and we don't abuse them. We don't use them in a negative capacity, like using it to assess performance. I use assessments to develop people, not to use it as a negative tool against them, if you will.
So I like that. I like the concept of really having something concrete to go on for you to plan your future, to plan your growth and your development. I really love that. I think they're very valuable.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're almost coming to the end of the show. Give us 3 tips that people can use or can remember when having assessments or thinking about it.
So the first thing I tell people, if you have an opportunity to do an assessment, do it, because the more you know about yourself, the better able that you are going to be able to develop yourself, understand what your strengths are and work from your strengths, and help to mitigate the weaknesses. The second thing is, I would make sure that you work with someone who's qualified to actually debrief that assessment so that you really understand and get the most value out of that assessment tool when you're using that. And then I think the third thing would be use that information, create a plan of action, but only pick 1 or 2 things, because we want you to be successful. We don't want you to be overwhelmed. So those would be 3 things that I would tell people.
Well, that's great. That's great advice. I could see where people could really utilize that to work their way right up to the top.
And that's what we'd like to see more of.
Exactly. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Lori.
You're welcome. So that's Lori Flaquet here at Focus Forward. And I love that show on assessments, and I hope everybody will take the opportunity when it comes, or maybe make that opportunity for themselves to learn more. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'd like you to like, subscribe, comment. We'd love to know what you're thinking. Bye-bye now.